Please go ahead. I have two questions for Professor Risky. You talked to us, Professor, about a number of elements that don't work, but you also referred a number of times to the current system of authorization of home cultivation for medical purposes of cannabis. Now, my question for you is, do you have any references for us on the studies that you conducted, or any reports that you have on this matter? Because I see that you talked about immense flaws in the medical system. Could you be a bit more specific, please? Because you talked about the infiltration of organized crime in so-called therapeutic cannabis. You say that this is quite probable. Do you have anything more? Do you have more clarity around that? Do you have information saying that organized crime has definitely infiltrated medical cannabis? Do you have specific information on what are the immense flaws in the medical system? Could you tell us a bit more about that then? Senator Dupuis, I wasn't talking about the medical system. I was talking for cannabis for therapeutic purposes, and I was talking about companies, not people who were doing home cultivation. Yes, I do have some knowledge about this, but right now I would like to invoke my solicitor-client privilege. When I invoke this privilege, I cannot answer who my client is. I can't tell you anything about it. Okay, so you cannot give us any information on your affirmation that there is an infiltration of organized crime in so-called therapeutic cannabis. You said it is quite probable. So you're saying you have no more information on that? I repeat, I invoke the solicitor-client privilege. Can you answer the question? That is, because you said that there are immense flaws in the system with regard to therapeutic cannabis. Can you specify which flaws? Pardon me? I'm sorry, I didn't understand the end of your question. What you call the immense flaws in the so-called therapeutic cannabis system. Here's an example. When you look at the regulation that authorizes security clearance, it states that the permit is issued after having vetted the agent, the director of the company, and all senior officials. The directors are also vetted, but a company is owned by its shareholders. So why aren't shareholders vetted as well? The ultimate shareholder. Is that one of the flaws? Well, that's the main flaw. Yes, thank you. You hadn't explained it that way. Thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Bédard. Mr. Bédard, you seem to have a great deal of experience in fighting organized crime. And I have a question for you. Can you tell us, now this is you're talking about it when it was criminalized. Can you tell us, in your opinion, based on your experience, what can be done in legalizing cannabis to ensure that that infiltration by organized crime, how can we stop this or reduce it based on your experience? In my opinion, I am absolutely against legalization. What can be done? Well, there should be no legislation that should allow for cultivation or sale of cannabis. I'm against it. I'm not the only one. Thank you. Senator Boisvenu, Vice Chair of the committee, followed by Senator Carignan. Please go ahead. Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank both of our witnesses. Professor Risky, I have a question because Radio-Canada in April 2017 stated that individual permits for cannabis cultivation had been issued to members of Hells Angels, and that other members had applied for permits for production areas. So that was revealed by Radio-Canada in April 2017. So now we're going to another regime where permits will be issued for recreational growth of cannabis recreational. So people who already have permits for producing cannabis for medical purposes, shouldn't they have to undergo vetting again or subject to the new regulation with regard to recreational permits? I'm thinking, for example, in Quebec, where the vetting is much more stringent concerning cannabis grown for recreational purposes, whereas people who have permits for medical cannabis have a very limited vetting process. So we might end up with two regimes, one that is very rigorous, I'm talking about the Quebec regime, and the other one that where cannabis is grown for medical purposes. It will almost not be vetted at all, so organized crime will be able to infiltrate it. So this whole regime, both regimes should be very stringent. Is my mic on? Yes. Ideally, I would go even further than the Quebec regime, because they vet shareholders who own 10%, but all shareholders should be vetted, because if you set a level of 10%, then obviously that can be used for shareholders who work together. Ideally, we should have minimum standards across the country that are the highest standards for vetting. Now, it's not a right to have a permit, it's a privilege. You have a question? Okay, I'm just going to come back to what you said. I've got to see a company here that has 25 sources of funding, of financing. And we're talking about, so they're below the threshold of 20%. So you're absolutely right. In that regard, you revealed that in Quebec there were 40% of investments that is made with money from tax havens. And I heard you in the media, you raised the idea of having a public registry of investors. If we really want to crack down on tax havens and on tax evasion, as well as tax fraud, corruption, and human trafficking, everything around organized crime will launder money through tax havens. And once again, the proceeds of crime will be sent towards places like Canada. And that's not just for cannabis. We can recycle everything on the stock exchange. In the report you're talking about, it's millions of dollars that is coming in from the Cayman Islands. And we're talking about 80% of the sums that came in from the Cayman Islands. I think it was La Presse. However, with a public registry, the best way of fighting this is transparency. This allows journalists to do their investigative work, and the registry should show two things: who the final shareholders are, and to get to that person, we have to stop the incorporation of shell companies. And in Canada, shell companies can be created very easily, and all they do is to funnel money through tax havens. And we need to publicize what interests certain elected officials have. So if there's any family relationship, we need to make sure that conflict of interest or appearance thereof is denounced. Senator Carignan, please go ahead.